Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from Wickersham County, Arkansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The summer of 1898 in rural Arkansas seemed more oppressive than usual. The humid heat hung over Wickersham County like a damp sheet permeating the walls of the wooden houses scattered across the rolling hills and dense forests. It was the kind of heat that made people slow down, that made conversations quieter, more measured. But for those living in the house at the end of Oak Ridge Trail, the silence came from something deeper than the heat. The property belonged to the Dunham sisters, Josephine and Adelaide, both in their 60s, descendants of one of the founding families of the county. The house stood out among other structures in the area due to its imposing size, with a front porch supported by weathered columns, tall windows protected by intricate wooden lattices, and a garden in the back that, neighbors said, had once been lush in other times. Now, however, weeds invaded the abandoned flower beds, and vines climbed up the peeling walls, creating shadows that seemed to shift at dusk. County records from that era described the residence as having been built in 1857 by Bartholomew Dunham, father of the sisters' father Montgomery, during the prosperous years before the Civil War. The architecture blended European elements brought back from Bartholomew's travels to England and France with adaptations to the southern climate. According to documents of the period, the house occupied approximately 2 acres of land and had 2 main floors, in addition to an attic and an extensive cellar that, curiously, occupied only half of the total area of the construction. It was common for passers-by to quicken their pace when walking past the residence, especially after sunset. There wasn't a specific reason for this, at least not one that could be clearly articulated. It was more of a sensation, a subtle discomfort, as if the house were watching those who passed by it. Interviews conducted by historian Archibald Harmon in 1958 with former residents of the region reveal that even before the disappearance of the Dunham sisters, the house already had a peculiar reputation. Mathilda Jenkins, a washerwoman who worked for several wealthy families in the area, reported, "That house was always different. Even when Mr. Montgomery Dunham was still alive, there was something strange there. The clothes I washed for them always had a smell. Not of common dirt, but something like damp earth and dried herbs, even the clean pieces. And the Dunham ladies always handed me the clothes personally, never allowed me past the service door." The official story, the one that appeared in county records, was simple. Josephine and Adelaide Dunham lived alone after the death of their father, Montgomery Dunham, which occurred in 1877. Without husbands or heirs, they dedicated themselves to managing the assets left by their father and were rarely seen in town. Their public appearances were limited to Sunday services at the Methodist Church, always dressed in dark clothing, always seated in the same pew, always alone. The details surrounding Montgomery Dunham's death, though apparently well documented, present intriguing inconsistencies. According to the official death certificate signed by Dr. Jeremiah Crawford on January 12, 1877, the cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest resulting from tropical fever. However, a more detailed medical report, found in the archives of the old Wickersham County Hospital, describes symptoms that hardly correspond to a simple fever. The patient exhibits periods of extreme agitation alternating with profound lethargy. He reports disturbing visions and insists there is something inside the walls watching him. The pupils remain dilated even under strong light, and the skin exhibits an abnormal pallor. Most disturbing is the fact that during episodes of delirium, he occasionally speaks in a language unknown to this physician. On March 14, 1898, the Dunham sisters did not appear at church service. Initially, no one gave much importance to this fact. Elderly people occasionally fall ill or simply decide to stay home. But when their absence extended to 3 consecutive Sundays, Reverend Thaddeus Whitmore decided to send his housekeeper, Martha Belmont, to check on the well-being of the sisters. Reverend Whitmore was not a man who easily intruded into the affairs of his parishioners, especially those belonging to the traditional families of the county. According to his personal diaries, kept in the diocesan library, he nurtured a peculiar respect for the Dunham sisters, mixed with something that could be described as apprehension. In an entry dated February 1896, he writes, "I spoke with Miss Josephine D. today. As always, her conversation was formal and contained, almost rehearsed. However, today I noticed something different in her eyes, a feverish gleam that does not match her usual composure. When I inquired about her health, she replied only that the nights have been long. At the end, she asked me something unusual. She wanted to know if I believed that the dead could return not by divine work, but by force of an earthly promise. I answered with Scripture, naturally, but the question disturbed me for the rest of the day. What Martha found, or more precisely, what she did not find, would initiate a series of events that would profoundly mark the memory of the county, though, with the passing years, many would prefer to forget." As recorded in the Sheriff's Report of April 4, 1898, filed at the Wickersham County Sheriff's Office, and later transferred to the State Historical Archive, Martha knocked at the door of the house at the end of Oak Ridge Trail for long minutes without receiving a response. Noticing that the door was not locked, merely ajar, the housekeeper decided to enter, calling out the names of the Dunham sisters. The interior of the house was impeccably clean and organized, as if it had been prepared to receive visitors. In the sitting room, on a side table, there was a half-empty teacup, already cold. No sign of struggle or disorder, no sign of the Dunham sisters. The sheriff's report, written by Deputy Clerk Hammond Pierce, under the dictation of Sheriff Zachariah Thornton, describes the scene with an almost clinical objectivity, but includes a curious detail. The housekeeper reports that, upon entering the residence, she noticed that all the clocks in the house had stopped at exactly 3:17, including the wall clock in the sitting room, the pocket watch on the desk in the study, and even the small clock in the main bedroom. Mrs. Belmont states that this detail caused her particular discomfort, though she could not explain why. Martha walked through all the rooms of the house, sitting room, kitchen, 4-bedroom study, without finding the owners. As she later reported to the sheriff, it was in the cellar that she noticed something unusual. An old trunk of dark wood, the kind used to store clothing or keepsakes, was open, something uncommon considering that the Dunham sisters were known to keep all their belongings carefully stored and locked away. The cellar of the residence deserves a more detailed description, as its unusual configuration would later become an object of interest for investigators of the case. Unlike typical cellars of colonial homes of the time, generally simple storage spaces with dirt floors, the cellar of the Dunham house had been constructed with evident attention to detail. The floor was of carved stone, the walls coated with a type of mortar that, according to specialists consulted years later, contained unusual components that made it exceptionally resistant to moisture. Illumination was provided by small barred windows at ground level, positioned in such a way that even on cloudy days, the environment received sufficient light. Most curious, however, was the division of space. Although the house occupied a considerable area, the accessible cellar corresponded to only about half of that area. The other half, according to architectural plans of the time, would simply be compacted earth. However, the wall that separated the two sections was not aligned with any upper wall of the house, creating an asymmetric layout that intrigued architects who later studied the case. Even more intriguing was the small door of dark wood, almost imperceptible, installed in the dividing wall. All was kept locked by the Dunham sisters. Inside the trunk, Martha found only a notebook with a black cover, apparently a diary. Leafing through it quickly, she noticed that the pages were filled with an elegant and precise handwriting, undoubtedly that of Josephine Dunham. However, something caught her attention. In the last written pages, the handwriting became progressively more tremulous, almost illegible, as if it had been recorded by someone under extreme stress or fear. The housekeeper took the notebook with her and went immediately to the sheriff's office, where she reported the disappearance of the elderly sisters to Sheriff Thornton. Sheriff Zachariah Thornton was not known for his investigative zeal. At 58 years old, he occupied the position more due to his political connections than professional competence. A former military man of intermediate rank, he had been appointed sheriff in 1892 after supporting the winning faction in a local electoral dispute. His record of solved cases was mediocre, especially when they involved influential families of the region. A journalist of the time, Tobias Steele, described him in a column as a man who prefers the comfort of his armchair to the discomfort of truth. The official investigation into the disappearance of the Dunham sisters was superficial and brief. After 3 days of searching the property and surroundings, without finding any trace of the elderly women, Sheriff Thornton concluded that they had probably traveled to visit relatives in Memphis without telling anyone. The case was filed, and the house at the end of Oak Ridge Trail was closed, awaiting the return of the owners. The investigation reports, although succinct, mention a detail that did not receive due attention at the time. During the inspection of the property, deputies found all the clothes and personal belongings of the Dunham sisters intact in the wardrobes. Their jewelry box contained all the pieces catalogued in their personal inventory, including valuable items such as a pearl necklace and a set of sapphire earrings that, according to witnesses, they highly valued as they had been gifts from their late father. In the drawer of the desk, a wallet containing a considerable amount of money remained untouched. If the elderly women had really traveled of their own free will, they had departed without taking any belongings or resources. However, the diary found by Martha was never annexed to the official process. Sheriff Thornton claimed to have returned it to the Reverend's housekeeper, who in turn claimed never to have received it back. For decades, the whereabouts of this document remained unknown, until in 1964, during the renovation of an old parsonage in Wickersham County, a carpenter named Sullivan Reed found a wooden box embedded in a false wall. Inside the box, wrapped in a black silk cloth, was the diary of Josephine Dunham. The discovery was initially kept secret by the carpenter, who, superstitious, feared that the object might be related to some unorthodox religious practice. It was only 3 months later, upon overhearing a casual conversation about the old mystery of the disappeared sisters, that Sullivan decided to reveal his discovery to his employer, the engineer Morris Blackwell, who in turn informed the ecclesiastical authorities. Reverend Julius Kensington, responsible for the parish at that time, took possession of the document and, after reading its contents, decided to turn it over to the History Department of Arkansas State University. However, for reasons never officially clarified, the diary was filed in the restricted documents section of the university library, where it remained inaccessible to the public for another 5 years. Reverend Kensington, a cultured and methodical man, educated in theology at Princeton University, was not given to superstitions or unnecessary alarms. This makes all the more intriguing the content of a letter he sent to the Bishop of Little Rock, along with his request to transfer the diary to the university. In the letter, partially preserved in diocesan archives, he writes, "Your Excellency will understand my hesitation in deciding the appropriate destination for this document. Its content, especially in the final pages, raises questions that transcend the scope of our common theological understanding. I suggest nothing of a supernatural nature. I am, as you know, averse to such explanations, but there is in these pages a testimony of something profoundly disturbing that I believe should be studied by minds prepared for deeper psychological and historical analyses. What concerns me is not so much what is written, but the evident transformation in the person who wrote it. In 1969, Professor Wesley Montgomery, during research on the social history of Arkansas in the early 20th century, obtained authorization to consult the document. What he found in the yellowed pages of Josephine Dunham's diary disturbed him deeply, leading him to abandon his original research and dedicate himself exclusively to the study of this case. Wesley Montgomery was not just a competent historian, but also a meticulous researcher with secondary training in psychology. Born in 1921 in Little Rock, he had served briefly in the Army during World War II before dedicating himself to academic life. His specialty was documenting oral histories and analyzing personal documents, such as letters and diaries, to reconstruct social and psychological aspects of historical periods. When he gained access to Josephine Dunham's diary, he was working on an extensive study of social transformations in rural Arkansas at the turn of the century. The first entries in the diary dated from January 1877, shortly after the death of Montgomery Dunham. They were mundane notes about the day-to-day life of the sisters, lists of tasks, expense records, occasionally reflections on loneliness and loss. The handwriting was firm, organized, reflecting the methodical personality that acquaintances attributed to Josephine Dunham. An entry from March 1877 offers a glimpse of the routine and mental state of the sisters at that time. March 17, 1877. Today we received a visit from Mr. Hargreaves' solicitor to deal with pending matters of the inventory. The papers are in order, as Father always kept them. The house, the lands in Wickersham County, and the shares in the Cotton Company remain as solid assets, sufficient to maintain Adelaide and myself comfortably for the rest of our days. I feel grateful for this, but would trade all this material security for a few more years with him. The nights are especially difficult. The house seems larger and emptier. Sometimes I wake, thinking I have heard his voice calling me from the study, as he did when he worked until late. The doctor recommended that I take valerian drops to help with sleep, but I hesitate. I prefer the lucidity of pain to the confusion induced by medicines. Over the following months, the entries follow a similar pattern, documenting the gradual adaptation of the Dunham sisters to their new reality. Josephine mentions occasional visits from acquaintances, decisions about the administration of their assets, and reflections on mourning. A recurring theme is her reluctance to modify any aspect of the house or dispose of their father's belongings, as if preserving the physical environment could, somehow, keep his presence alive. A curious entry from August 1877 mentions the cellar of the house for the first time. August 22, 1877. I needed to go down to the cellar today to fetch some bottles of wine for dinner with Judge Harrington. I had not entered there since Father's death. He always insisted on being the only one to handle that particular wine cellar. Strangely, I found the small door at the back ajar, though I am certain it should have been locked. The key, which Father always carried with him, was in the lock. I did not dare to look at what lies beyond it. I never entered that compartment. Father said it was merely a storage space for old family objects, things without value, but that he did not have the heart to discard. I closed the door, removed the key, and now keep it with me. Tomorrow I will ask our groundskeeper to check if there is any external entrance that might explain how that door came to be open. However, from November 1897, the tone of the entries began to subtly change. Josephine began to record strange sensations, nocturnal noises that she could not identify, a persistent sensation of being watched, objects that seemed to change place when she wasn't looking. November 16, 1897. Again that sound, like nails scratching wood, coming from the walls. I asked our groundskeeper to check for possible rats, but he found no trace. Perhaps it is just the old house settling, as he suggested, but why always at midnight? Jefferson Powell was the gardener and handyman who worked for the Dunham sisters 3 times a week. According to county employment records, he left service at the house on Oak Ridge Trail in December 1897, claiming to have found a better position at a farm on the outskirts of the county. However, when Professor Montgomery managed to locate a relative of Jefferson, Harriet Powell, in 1969, she told a different story. Jefferson never spoke about that house, nor about the old ladies. When we asked why he had left a stable job in the county to work so far away, he would only say that there were things that money couldn't compensate for. The night before leaving for the farm, I heard him tell his wife that the walls of that house had eyes and ears. We never understood what he meant by that. Harriet also revealed to Professor Montgomery a disturbing detail that does not appear in any official record. Her brother, a previously healthy and robust man, began to waste away shortly after leaving employment at the Dunham house. It was as if something were consuming him from within, she described. He lost weight, lost his appetite, and at night suffered from nightmares so intense that he would scream until hoarse. Before dying, just 6 months after leaving that house, he raved about something that lived between the walls, and repeated, "I shouldn't have looked, shouldn't have opened that door." The entries in the diary became more disturbing as December advanced. Josephine reported having seen a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed during the night, which disappeared when she lit the lamp. She mentioned whispering voices that seemed to come from within the walls, speaking words she could not understand, but which somehow seemed directed at her. On January 2nd, 1898, she wrote, "I found that photograph again at the bottom of the dresser drawer, although I am certain I burned it 3 days ago. How is this possible?" The image seems different now. His eyes seem to follow me around the room. Tomorrow I will burn it again, and this time I will scatter the ashes in the garden. The photograph in question was never found, and the diary does not specify whose image it was. Considering that Josephine refers to the person in the photograph as he in capital letters, Professor Montgomery initially assumed it to be her late father. However, later entries cast doubt on this interpretation. On January 5th, she writes, "I did not sleep again. The sounds in the walls continue, louder now, more insistent. They no longer seem like scratches, but rhythmic knocks, as if someone or something were trying to communicate through a code. I have made the decision to check the cellar tomorrow, the small door in the back, which has remained locked all these years. Perhaps there is something there that explains these phenomena." The key is still with me, kept in the jewelry box since that day in 1877. Father made me promise never to open it, but he is no longer here to protect me from whatever might be on the other side. What if what torments me is precisely there? On January 6th, the entry is brief and disturbing. I went down to the cellar today. The key was no longer in the jewelry box, although I am certain I left it there last night. I found it in the lock of the small door, as if someone had placed it there. The door was ajar. The smell that came from inside, I cannot describe it adequately, a mixture of damp earth, mold, and something else, something metallic like old blood or rusted iron. I did not have the courage to open the door completely or enter. I locked it again and brought the key with me. Tonight I will sleep with it under my pillow. On January 15th, Josephine reports a recurring dream. The same dream for the 3rd consecutive night. I am standing before that door in the cellar, the one I always keep locked. In the dream, I know I should not open it, but my hands move against my will. When the door opens, I see only darkness and feel an intense cold coming from within. Then, from the depths of that darkness, I hear that voice, not Father's, but the other, the one that promised to return. "I am fulfilling my promise," says the voice. And then I wake up, always at 3:17 in the morning, with the sensation that someone is sitting on the edge of my bed. The reference to the other voice and the promise of return is particularly intriguing, as there is no previous mention in the diary of such a promise or who might have made it. Professor Montgomery dedicated considerable time trying to discover if there might be some secret door or hidden room in the cellar of the house on Oak Ridge Trail, but when he finally obtained permission to examine the property in May 1969, he discovered that the cellar had been completely cemented over during a renovation carried out in 1926, when the house was briefly occupied by a family of merchants from St. Louis. This family, the Vaughns, remained on the property for just 7 months, a notably short period considering the substantial investment they had made in renovating the house. Leopold Vaughn, patriarch of the family, was a successful merchant who had built a prosperous import business. In 1926, at 52 years old, he decided to acquire a residence that reflected his social status, and the old Dunham house, which had remained closed for years, presented itself as an opportunity. Records of the time show that Vaughn contracted the architect Frederick Hartman to supervise an extensive renovation of the property, including modernizations such as electrical installation and internal plumbing. A curious detail appears in the architect's notes, preserved in the County Public Archive. Client insisted on completely cementing over the cellar after incident with the workers. I suggested keeping at least one section as a wine cellar, given the favorable climate, but Mr. Vaughn was adamant. "I want that space permanently sealed," were his exact words. Lee. The incident mentioned is not detailed in the official notes, but Professor Montgomery managed to get some information through an assistant of Frederick Hartman, who worked on the project. According to this assistant, who accompanied the project, 2 workers who were removing rubble from the cellar discovered a small door embedded in the back wall. Curious, they forced the lock and found a narrow compartment, no larger than a closet. What they saw inside was never fully clarified, but both men abandoned the job the same day, refusing to return, even when offered double pay. One of them, according to reports, moved away from the county the following week. As the end of January approached, the entries in the diary became more spaced out and fragmented. The handwriting began to show signs of deterioration, with words crossed out and spots that could be tears or spilled ink. On January 27th, there is a particularly disturbing entry. "I can no longer sleep. When I close my eyes, I feel his presence in the room. The walls are damp now, though it has not rained. The dampness forms patterns that look like watching faces. The smell. That same smell of wet earth and something else, something I recognize but cannot name. I should have burned all those objects when I had the chance. Now it is too late. Father knew. He tried to warn me." An entry from January 29th contains an even more unsettling account. Someone or something has been walking through the house during the night. I hear the footsteps above my room. In the attic that has remained locked for years, the creaking of the floorboards is unmistakable. Last night I gathered the courage to go up and check. The attic door was locked, as always, the key kept in the drawer of my desk. But upon placing my ear against the wood, I distinctly heard breathing on the other side, heavy and irregular. Even more disturbing was that, as I moved away, the breathing abruptly stopped, as if whatever was inside knew I was listening. I returned to my room and locked the door. In the early morning I woke to the sound of scratching at my door. It was not like an animal trying to enter, but something deliberate. 3 slow scratches, followed by 3 quicker ones, then a pause, and the pattern repeated. I remained motionless in a bed, without the courage to check. The scratching continued for almost an hour, then ceased. In the morning, I examined the door. There were no visible marks on the wood. On January 31st, Josephine makes a cryptic reference to an event from the past. I have thought much about that night, the last when Father seemed truly lucid before the illness consumed him completely. He called me to his study late at night and handed me the key to that door in the cellar, making me swear never to open it. "What we did was wrong, Josephine," he said. "I should not have brought that into our house. I should not have made that agreement." I never knew what agreement he referred to. Father always dealt with his business privately, but I remember that in 1874, after returning from a trip to New Orleans, he changed. He became more reserved, spent hours alone in the cellar, and occasionally I heard him conversing down there, though I never saw anyone enter or leave. It was after this trip that the compartment in the back of the cellar was constructed officially to store important documents. Now I wonder what is really kept in there. The last regular entry dates from February 9th, 1898. "I found marks on the cellar floor today, as if something heavy had been dragged toward that door. I did not enter. I cannot. But I know I must face him eventually. The voices are louder now, almost distinct enough to understand what they say. I think they are calling my name, or perhaps it is just the wind. Tomorrow I will go to the church to speak with Reverend Whitmore. Perhaps he can help." There is no record that Josephine did in fact seek out Reverend Whitmore. According to the parish visitation book preserved in the diocesan archives, her last confession occurred on January 26, 1898. However, there exists an intriguing document in the Reverend's personal archives, a handwritten note on high-quality paper signed by Josephine Dunham and dated February 10, 1898. "Reverend Whitmore, I beg your forgiveness for not attending our scheduled meeting today. Unforeseen circumstances require my presence at home. The matter about which I intended to consult you has become more urgent than I imagined. I ask for your prayers, as I fear I am facing something that transcends my understanding and, perhaps, the very doctrine of the Church. If we do not see each other again in this world, know that I departed in peace with my conscience, though not necessarily in peace with what inhabits between these walls. May God protect you, Josephine Dunham." Reverend Whitmore never mentioned this note publicly, and it was only discovered after his death in 1925. Among his personal documents, after the entry of February 9th, there is an interval of almost a month without annotations. Then, on March 10th, 4 days before her absence was first noticed, there is a final entry. The handwriting is almost unrecognizable, trembling and hasty, as if written by someone on the verge of collapse. "It is here, in the house, with me. It is not Father, it never was. The cellar door is open now. It was not I who opened it. The sounds it makes as it moves through the walls. I cannot stay any longer. But where to go when he is everywhere? The photographs, all of them, even those I burned, have returned. The faces in the photos have changed. They all have his eyes now. I need to end this. There is only one way." This is the last clearly legible entry in the diary. In the final pages there are only incoherent scribbles and what appear to be frustrated attempts to draw something, perhaps a face or a symbol. On the last page there is a single phrase, written in a surprisingly clear and firm handwriting, so different from the previous text that it raised questions about whether it had been written by the same person. I finally understood what he wanted from the beginning. Professor Wesley Montgomery spent the following years trying to construct a clearer chronology of events and determine what really happened to the Dunham sisters. In his research notebooks, found after his death in 1975, he raises several hypotheses from supernatural explanations, which he himself dismissed as products of the feverish imagination of lonely elderly women, to more mundane possibilities. An intruder who tormented the sisters, some distant relative, with interest in their inheritance, or even a case of progressive mental deterioration that culminated in escape or suicide. One of the aspects that most intrigued the professor was the coincidence between the recurring time in Josephine's dreams, 3:17, and the fact that all the clocks in the house were found stopped at this same time. This coincidence suggested that something significant had occurred at that specific moment, possibly on the night before her disappearance. Another disturbing element that Montgomery highlighted in his notes was the final phrase of the diary. The handwriting of that last entry, so different from the rest, raised questions about its authenticity. Would it be possible that someone else had written that line? And if so, who? And what would be the meaning of that understanding mentioned? One of the most intriguing aspects that Montgomery discovered during his investigation were the death records of Montgomery Dunham. According to the official document, he died of natural causes on January 12, 1877. However, upon examining the archives of the old Wickersham County Hospital, the professor found a medical report that offered additional details. The father had suffered from mysterious ailment that caused severe hallucinations in the weeks prior to his death. The responsible physician, Dr. Vincent Holloway, described that the patient frequently spoke about something that lived inside the walls and insisted that he had made an agreement that he could not fulfill. This medical report, dated January 10, 1877, includes additional observations that Montgomery considered particularly relevant. The patient alternates between periods of lucidity and episodes of extreme agitation. During moments of mental clarity, he expresses a rational and consistent fear related to an agreement that he supposedly made during his trip to New Orleans in 1874. Although reluctant to provide specific details, he mentioned having acquired an ancient object from a merchant in the French Quarter, an object which he now keeps stored in a special compartment in his residence. More concerning is his insistence that this object is not inanimate. Mr. Dunham, a man of education and respectable social position, does not seem given to superstitions. However, he describes with disturbing conviction that the object changed after being brought to his home, and that it now communicates with him through the walls. When questioned about the nature of these communications, the patient becomes extremely agitated, refusing to elaborate. In the last 48 hours, his physical state has deteriorated significantly. He presents permanently dilated pupils, even under intense light, abnormally low body temperature, and a peculiar odor emanating from the skin that does not correspond to any pathological condition known to this physician. There are also inexplicable marks on the forearms and neck, similar to bruises, but with a regular pattern that suggests more a deliberate contact than accidental injuries. As a physician, I must record only observable facts, but I confess that this case defies my scientific understanding. If I were a man of lesser education, I might suggest that Mr. Dunham is under some kind of malevolent influence. As I am not, I limit myself to documenting his condition and administering the prescribed sedatives to alleviate his suffering, though I fear the outcome is inevitably fatal. Muffs. Montgomery Dunham passed away 2 days after the drafting of this report. The death certificate, signed by the same Dr. Vincent Holloway, lists cardiac arrest as the cause of death, omitting all the disturbing details documented in the hospital report. During his research, Professor Montgomery also interviewed several old residents of the county, including Cordelia Hayes, who in 1898 was a young woman of 19 who lived 2 houses down from the Dunham residence. According to Cordelia's testimony recorded in 1969, at that time nobody spoke openly about the house of the old ladies, but everyone knew there was something strange there. My mother forbade me from passing in front of that house alone. On full moon nights, sometimes we heard sounds coming from there. They weren't screams nor voices exactly, but a kind of low lament, like someone humming a sad melody. On the morning they discovered the sisters had disappeared, I was returning from the bakery and saw something I never told the authorities. I saw a man leaving the house very early, even before the sun rose. He wore a hat that covered his face and carried something in his arms, wrapped in a dark cloth. At the time, I thought it might be a doctor, perhaps, who had been called during the night. But now, thinking about it, why would a doctor leave carrying something like that, instead of simply doing his work and leaving? This testimony raises disturbing questions about the events of that morning. Who would the man seen by Cordelia be? What was he carrying? And why did this information never reach official authorities? In a note following the interview with Cordelia, Professor Montgomery writes, "The description of the man seen by C.H. curiously corresponds to reports of a stranger who was occasionally seen visiting Montgomery Dunham in the months preceding his death. According to Martha Belmont, this visitor never identified himself, always arrived after sunset, and Mr. Dunham insisted on receiving him alone in the study or in the cellar. The housekeeper described him as a thin man, very pale, of considerable height, always dressed in dark clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face." Coincidence? Or would it be possible that the same individual was somehow connected to both the death of the father and the disappearance of his daughters 11 years later? The house on Oak Ridge Trail remained closed for many years after the disappearance of the Dunham sisters. In 1926, it was acquired by the merchant Leopold Vaughn, who carried out extensive renovations before moving in with his family. Curiously, the Vaughns occupied the property for only 7 months before suddenly moving away, selling the house for a value well below market. When questioned about the reasons for the move, Leopold Vaughn is said to have stated only that the house was not suitable for a family with peace of mind. During the interview he gave to Professor Montgomery in 1969, Leopold Vaughn, then 95 years old and residing in Chicago, showed himself extremely reluctant to discuss his brief occupation of the house on Oak Ridge Trail. Only after much insistence did he agree to provide some details, with the express condition that the conversation not be recorded. According to Montgomery's notes, Vaughn reported that in the first weeks after the move, the family was enthusiastic about the new residence. The renovation had been extensive, modernizing the house without compromising its historic character. However, after approximately 1 month, inexplicable events began to occur. At first they were small things, Vaughn supposedly said, objects that disappeared and reappeared in different places. Strange sounds in the walls, like scratches or rhythmic knocks. My wife complained of a persistent odor in the main bedroom, a smell of damp earth and something metallic that no cleaning could eliminate. We replaced the floorboards, checked plumbing, even removed part of the wall coverings, but the smell always returned. The incident that finally motivated the move, according to Vaughn, occurred one night in July 1926. His wife woke up screaming, claiming to have seen a dark figure standing at the foot of the bed. When Vaughn turned on the light, there was no one there. However, on the dresser, they found an object that did not belong to them, a small carved wooden box containing a single photograph. "It was a photograph of an elderly woman seated in a chair," said Vaughn. "Behind her, there was something like a shadow, but with a vaguely human shape. Most disturbing were the woman's eyes. They were completely black, like holes in the image. I immediately recognized her as one of the former owners, Miss Josephine Dunham, whose portrait I had seen at the county clerk's office when we signed the purchase papers. On the back of the photograph was a phrase written, 'He lives in the walls and wants company.'" The following morning, Vaughn contracted workers to completely cement over the cellar, especially the hidden compartment that had been discovered during renovation. A week later, the family left the house, never returning even to retrieve many of the personal objects they left behind. In the years that followed, the property passed through several owners, none remaining for more than 2 years. In 1952, after standing empty for almost a decade, it was finally demolished to make way for a small commercial building, which initially housed a pharmacy and, later, a fabric store. During the demolition, as reported in the Wickersham Gazette of July 17, 1952, the workers made a macabre discovery. Upon removing the cemented floor of the cellar, they found a small wooden door sealed with what appeared to be black wax. The foreman of the work, Jeremiah Watkins, decided to open the door, revealing a small compartment no larger than a closet. Inside, there were only 3 items: an old box of matches, a broken perfume bottle, and a faded photograph. The report does not offer details about the content of the photograph, mentioning only that it was handed over to the authorities. However, there is no record of this photograph in the police archives of the time. The only indication of its possible content comes from an interview given by Jeremiah Watkins himself to Professor Montgomery in 1968. I will never forget that image as long as I live. It was a photograph of an elderly woman, probably Miss Josephine Dunham, seated in a chair. Behind her, there was an obscure figure, like a shadow with human form. Most disturbing were the eyes of the woman in the photo. They were completely black, as if someone had covered them with ink, and there was a message written on the back of the photograph. But it was so faded that I could distinguish only a few words: fulfilled, promise, inside, walls. Watkins also revealed a detail that he omitted from the press at the time. Beside the photograph, they found what appeared to be a small carved bone box, similar to an ancient reliquary. The box was empty, except for a thin layer of dark dust at the bottom. When questioned about what happened to this object, Watkins confessed to having been disturbed by the discovery and decided to burn it that same night, along with the box of matches. The photograph, being potentially relevant to the old case of the disappearance, was the only thing he handed over to the authorities. Professor Wesley Montgomery died in September 1975 before concluding his research on the case of the Dunham sisters. His notes and collected materials were donated to the university library, but inexplicably, a large part of this collection disappeared during a reorganization of the archive in 1968, leaving only some field notebooks and correspondence. The inexplicable loss of these documents, ironically similar to the disappearance of Josephine Dunham's original diary from police records, was attributed to an administrative error by the library management. However, Penelope Stewart, the professor's assistant who helped him catalog the material before donation, expressed doubts about this explanation. We meticulously organized all the collection related to the case. There were more than 12 notebooks of annotations, photographs of the house before demolition, copies of official documents, transcriptions of interviews, all cataloged in 3 file boxes with clear labels. The professor was extremely methodical. It is simply impossible that all this material was lost through a common bureaucratic error. In one of these remaining notebooks, dated August 1969, Montgomery records a disturbing personal experience. After months investigating the case, he began to suffer from insomnia and to hear strange sounds in his own home. Scratches on the walls, footsteps in the corridor when he was alone, the creaking of a rocking chair in his study, although he did not possess such furniture. In his last known annotation about the case, he writes, "I dreamed of her last night. Josephine Dunham was standing in the cellar of the house on Oak Ridge Trail before that door. She looked directly at me and said, 'You, too, made a promise, Professor.' When I woke up, I found a box of matches, identical to the one described in the demolition report on my desk. I don't know how it got there. My house was locked. Tomorrow, I will end this research. There are questions that should not be answered, mysteries that should remain buried. Josephine Dunham understood this too late. I still have time." Professor Montgomery formally abandoned his research on the case of the Dunham sisters shortly after this incident, returning to his previous studies on the social history of Arkansas. He rarely mentioned the subject, and when questioned, would say only that he had lost interest in the story. A curious detail documented by his assistant Penelope is that the professor insisted on burning all his notebooks of annotations related to the case that were still in his personal possession. The assistant also reported a change in his behavior after abandoning the research. He began to avoid working after nightfall, installed additional lighting in his home, and developed an almost phobic aversion to enclosed spaces such as cellars and attics. The truth about what happened to Josephine and Adelaide Dunham in March 1898 remains a mystery. Their bodies were never found. No concrete evidence of crime was established. Official records continue to list their case as disappearance. In 1960, a journalist from the Arkansas Gazette named Howard Spencer attempted to reopen the investigation, fascinated by the urban legend that had formed around the Sisters' House, as it was known locally. He managed to locate and interview Martha Belmont, the Reverend's housekeeper who had found the house empty in 1898. Martha, then 83 years old, showed signs of senile dementia, but in moments of lucidity told Spencer something she had never officially mentioned. When I entered that house, I immediately felt that something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence or the absence of the ladies. It was as if the house were breathing. The walls seemed to pulse subtly, like a heart beating, very slowly. And there was a smell, not of decomposition or illness, but of freshly dug earth and candle wax. Most strange was what I found in the bedroom. The bed was perfectly made, as if no one had slept in it. On the pillow there was a single object, an old key, large probably to the cellar, and beside the key, almost imperceptible against the white of the sheet, small stains of a dark liquid that I preferred to believe was ink. Martha also revealed to the journalist a detail that she had omitted from the police in 1898 for fear of being considered superstitious or mentally unstable. When I went down to the cellar to check if the Dunham sisters might be there, I noticed that the small door at the back, the one they always kept locked, was ajar. The strong smell of wet earth came from there. I approached with trepidation, but something impelled me to look. The compartment beyond the door was small, like a closet built into the wall, but it seemed to extend deeper than the structure of the house would allow. The inner walls were of compacted earth, not masonry like the rest of the cellar. In the center there was an object that I could not immediately identify. It appeared to be a small carved box made of some material that was neither wood nor metal. Beside it, a photograph turned face down. I touched nothing. Something in that place caused me an instinctive dread, something I cannot explain. I closed the door, ran up the stairs, and never returned to that house. Howard Spencer's article about the case was published in a Sunday edition of the Arkansas Gazette in July 1960, but did not generate the interest he had hoped for. The story had become just another urban legend among so many others that populated the imagination of the county. Spencer himself soon moved on to other subjects, and the mystery of the Dunham sisters was again relegated to oblivion. A disturbing coincidence, not publicly recorded, was the sudden death of Howard Spencer just 3 months after the publication of his article. According to the death certificate, he died in his sleep, victim of a heart attack, at 42 years of age. A colleague from the newsroom, however, confided to Professor Montgomery that in the weeks prior to his death, Spencer had become increasingly paranoid, claiming to hear strange sounds in his apartment and to feel constantly watched. He also mentioned having found, without explanation, an old box of matches on his desk, similar to the one described in the demolition report of the house. Today, the site where the house at the end of Oak Ridge Trail once stood houses a small department store. The older employees sometimes comment on strange nocturnal occurrences, merchandise that changes place, sounds of footsteps on the upper floor when the establishment is empty, and occasionally the persistent aroma of old perfume that seems to emanate from the walls. The current manager, Ruth Simmons, who has worked at the location since 1968, reports that these occurrences intensify in certain periods of the year, particularly in March, the month of the disappearance of the Dunham sisters. It's something that everyone who works here for some time ends up noticing. It's not frightening, it's more uncomfortable, as if you were never really alone in the building, even when you clearly are. Some employees refuse to close the store alone, especially on Mondays. I don't know why specifically on Mondays, but that's when the strange things seem to happen most frequently. The air gets heavier, like before a storm, and that smell of old perfume appears, a sweet aroma, but with an underlying note of damp earth. And sometimes, just for an instant, you have the sensation of seeing someone from the corner of your eye, usually near the staircase that used to lead to the cellar. When you turn, no one is there. Recently, in 1968, during a renovation of the store's floor, workers found, embedded in the concrete, a small silver medallion with the inscription J.D. 1898. The object was donated to the County Historical Museum, where it remains on display, a silent reminder that some secrets resist the passage of time. Curiously, the museum employee responsible for cataloging the piece, Bartholomew Hayes, reported a strange incident related to the medallion. According to him, on the first night after the item was placed on exhibition, the museum's security cameras recorded an inexplicable failure precisely at 3:17 in the morning, lasting exactly 7 minutes. When the system began functioning again, the medallion had moved inside the display case, rotating 180 degrees. Technicians examined the system and found no explanation for the failure. What really happened to Josephine and Adelaide Dunham in that house on Oak Ridge Trail? Were they victims of a common crime, committed by someone interested in their fortune? Did they succumb to madness and isolation, fleeing or taking their own lives? Or is there something darker in the story, something that official records and rational explanations cannot completely capture? Perhaps the answer lies in the last legible words of Josephine's diary. I finally understood what he wanted from the beginning. What would this late understanding be? And who or what was he? Professor Montgomery, in his final notes on the case, offers an intriguing perspective. After months of investigation, I find myself contemplating possibilities that my academic training hesitates to accept. The patterns are undeniable. The black eyes in the photographs, the persistent smell of damp earth and metal, the sounds in the walls, the specific time. 3:17, that appears repeatedly, the sensation of being watched, the progressive mental deterioration of people who delve into the mystery, and, most disturbing, the obscure figure consistently described by witnesses separated by decades. There is an element in this case that resists conventional explanations, something that seems to persist beyond the demolition of the house, beyond the death of the original witnesses, beyond even time itself, like an echo that refuses to dissipate, or a presence that has found a way to transcend the physical limits that should contain it. I dare not fully articulate what I suspect. But the last phrase in Josephine Dunham's diary, "I finally understood what he wanted from the beginning," continues to resonate. What did she comprehend? And why did this understanding coincide with her disappearance? There exists an old concept in Southern folklore, rarely discussed openly, called the soul buyer. A being that is not exactly human, that makes agreements, grants wishes, but eventually returns to collect a payment much more valuable than the beneficiary initially realizes. Would it be possible that Montgomery Dunham, during his mysterious trip to New Orleans, encountered something of this nature, something that he brought home, confining it in that sealed compartment in the cellar, only to discover too late that some entities cannot be truly contained? Pure speculation, naturally. The most probable explanation remains being a conventional crime or a tragic case of mental instability. However, I cannot ignore the chill I feel when rereading the accounts, nor the persistent sensation that, in investigating this mystery, I have attracted some kind of unwanted attention. Some stories have no definitive conclusion, only echoes that resonate through the decades, reminding us that not all mysteries were meant to be unraveled. The case of the Dunham sisters is one of those echoes, a whisper from the past that, even after more than a century, still makes us look with suspicion at old walls and dark cellars, wondering what might be hidden beyond appearances. And if, by chance, you find yourself walking through the historic streets of Wickersham County at dusk, and feel a sudden chill, as if being watched, if you perceive a vague aroma of old perfume in the air, perhaps it is just coincidence, or perhaps it is a reminder that some presences never really leave. Some promises once made are impossible to break. There is an old saying in Arkansas, "Not all stories end when a person dies." In the case of the Dunham sisters, it seems the story only began with their disappearance, and perhaps, in some sense, we do not completely understand, still continues to this day. And you, who now know this story, have you checked the walls of your house today? Have you paid attention to the sounds that come from them when all is silent? And if, by chance, you wake at 3:17 in the morning, perhaps it would be prudent to avoid looking at the dark corners of the room. Some things, once seen, cannot be forgotten. Some stories, once known, become part of us. As the ancients said, knowledge is power, but some knowledge is also a burden, and some doors once opened can never truly be closed again.